Hi, good morning. I was hoping to be able to sit while I read, but I don't think our technology will make me do that. So I'm going to sort of speak at this podium, and I want to welcome you all to the symposium, and thank you for being here, and thank you for having been to the exhibition. And I should also stress that I'm the only art historian speaking today, funny enough, even though it's a symposium tied to an art history exhibition, which is it's a great pleasure for me because it will allow me to get a perspective from different scholars that are not necessarily bound with my field, and I'm sure it's going to make for a very pleasant day for all of us. So you'll be seeing a lot of slides from me, which is probably not what you will be seeing from the others, except maybe for Susan Dean Smith. So bear with me and with our technology. Casta painting is one of the most fascinating artistic genres from colonial Mexico and the 18th century in general. The works represent the complex process of racial mixing among the three main groups that inhabited the colony: Indians, Spaniards, and Africans. Created as sets, the works typically include 16 scenes painted on separate canvases or copper plates and depict a man and a woman of different races with one or two of their children. Occasionally, however, the scenes are represented on a single compartmentalized surface, as you can see on the left, actually on the right, and an accompanying inscription identifies the racial mix of the subjects. In addition to presenting a typology of human races, most casta paintings include samplings of local objects, food products, flora and fauna of the New World. The genre proved so popular in the 18th century that well over 100 sets were created to satisfy a growing demand. Despite the fact that casta paintings span the entire 18th century, they were created beginning in 1711 and ceased to be produced around 1810 at the time of Mexico's independence. They have traditionally been considered a homogeneous pictorial genre commissioned by Spanish functionaries as souvenirs of their stays in New Spain. In other words, scholars have regarded the paintings as examples of exotic art designed to showcase to a curious European audience those aspects that distinguish Mexico from the Old World. In addition, scholars have tended to place a production of casta painting within the context of the Enlightenment in Spain, at a time when the influence of the Swedish naturalist Carl Linneo was taking hold in Europe. While it is true that Linneo's Systema Naturae of 1735 exerted a tremendous influence on scientists, philosophers, and intellectuals across the Western world, the earliest casta paintings predate the works of this taxonomist by more than 2 decades. The interest in classification, evident in casta painting, preceded the Enlightenment, arising in classical and medieval times. To insist that casta paintings are solely the product of the Enlightenment in Europe is therefore not only reductive but misleading. In this presentation, I will address the rise of casta painting by focusing on a number of early images from the first half of the 18th century, and I will show that far from accurately documenting the process of racial mixing, the paintings offer a highly mediated vision of reality tied to larger imperial designs, both Spanish and Creole. And Susan Dean Smith, I'm assuming, will talk more about the later paintings that date from after the second half of the 18th century. I'm exclusively focusing on the rise of the genre and some of the earliest works. The Enlightenment is generally credited with fostering the acute observation and categorization of all manifestations of life, giving impetus to the exploration of other cultures and prompting the logical arrangement of these discoveries. Yet, the fascination with other cultures, other with relation to Europe, that is, has a long tradition in the Western world. Before the discovery of America in the 15th century, Europeans believed the farthest edges of the earth to be inhabited by monstrous races: giants, pygmies, two-headed men, Amazons, and hermaphrodites. Artists created many images, especially as illustrations for manuscripts and books, reflecting this fantastical vision. Expeditions of exploration and conquest increased the interest in a larger, previously unknown world and provided fertile ground for the fascination with the marvelous. Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese voyages to the Orient, Middle East, and Africa from the 1550s onward prolonged this interest well into the 18th century and beyond. This expanding interest in foreign cultures propelled a gradual increase in texts devoted to the customs of humankind. The constant desire in Europe to receive news from far-flung lands and peoples created a robust market for images of the world's different inhabitants. And on the screen you see 2 pages from the Italian Cesare Vecellio's book titled Habiti Antichi et Moderni de Tutto il Mondo of 1598, a compendium that he divided into several books, each one devoted to a different region of the world, which he then arranged hierarchically. The clothing of European countries feature at the beginning, followed by those of Africa, Asia, and lastly, America. The physical characteristics and customs of the natives of America greatly attracted the attention of Europeans. In addition, the New World represented an untapped source of wealth. An entry of a well-known geographical dictionary of the period, for example, describes the Americas as, quote, the producer of many medicinal and edible plants, different varieties of domestic and wild animals, birds, fish, excellent fruits, and a large quantity of sugar. Everything that is important there from Europe sells extremely well. The natives are spirited, agile, strong, and very fast runners. They swim like fishes. But they are naturally lazy, savage, and revengeful. End of quote. As this entry demonstrates, curiosity, power, and material interests were hard to separate when reporting on the New World. The conflation of the colony's local products with its variegated population makes casta painting no exception. What sets casta paintings apart from the type of representations that you see on the screen, however, is that they are carefully constructed images of the self. In other words, colonial artists and/or their patrons were aware of this type of visual tradition, which they studied and supplied new images of themselves. In fact, Europe's fascination with the Americas, coupled with the desire to portray colonial life in a positive light, lies at the core of casta painting. By the end of the 17th century, a well-defined sense of Creole identity had crystallized in New Spain. In 1680, when the renowned Creole savant, Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, wrote, "Admire what is yours instead of what is foreign," he was voicing a sentiment present among a large number of the Creole elite. This strong sense of belonging to the land, known as criollismo, is essential for understanding the rise of casta painting. Numerous authors, born in the Iberian Peninsula and in New Spain, celebrated the grandeur of Mexico. The Franciscan friar Agustín de Ventacourt, in his Tratado de la Ciudad de México, 1698, for example, extolled the orderly plan of Mexico City, the magnificence of its buildings, the natural resources and wealth of the colony, the intelligence of its population, and the profound devotion of its citizens. In other words, he described Mexico as blessed with riches and divinely protected. Mexico's racial diversity was legendary, but it also caused great anxiety among Spaniards obsessed with racial purity. The process of miscegenation was amply criticized by the colony's elite because it was thought to corrupt the natives and threaten the stability of the Spanish order. And this is a topic that will be developed much more fully by Marielena Martinez and Verena Stolke throughout this symposium, so I'm not going to deal with all the intricacies of racial labeling and the mingling of cultures that will be dealt with a little later. In addition, racial mixing was a topic of conversation among Europeans. It was thought to be especially rampant in the New World and to contribute to the formation of a society of degraded hybrids. Numerous texts and images produced in Mexico in the late 17th century offer views designed to counter the negative perception of the colony as a land of uncanny monsters, to borrow the words of a contemporary Spanish author, and to extol the uniqueness of Mexico. Although the process of miscegenation was amply criticized by the colony's elite, it was also perceived as a reality that distinguished the New World from the Old. Thus, so long as hierarchy was inscribed within it, it merited attention. Several paintings describe the grandeur of Mexico in terms of its architecture, natural resources, and people, and constitute a visual precedent for the development of casta painting. Cristóbal de Villalpando's monumental depiction of the Plaza Mayor that you see on the screen offers a view of Mexico City's main plaza, which includes the Viceroy's Palace in the back, the steel and finished cathedral to the left, and in the center, the Parián, or Central Marketplace. A similar rendition is visible in a work by Manuel Arellano of 1709, which portrays New Spain's different social groups as they congregate to honor the Virgin of Guadalupe during the procession of her new sanctuary in the hill of Tepeyac. Tourist Palace and the Sanctuary of Guadalupe, populated with what appears to be an integrated and restrained multiracial society. Similarly, early casta paintings manifest a concern with the construction of a distinctive self-image. The paintings represent an attempt to systematize the complex process of racial mixing, thereby creating order of what was perceived as an increasingly confusing society. Showing the different racial types dressed luxuriously emphasized the wealth of the colony as well as illustrated an integrated and restrained multiracial society. In the earliest known set of casta paintings by Manuel Arellano, the careful attention given to the attire of the mulatto woman wearing a profusion of pearls not only underscores the colony's wealth, but also reveals the artist's wish to bring out the importance of the figure. This is corroborated by the work's inscription, which stresses New Spain's prominent place in the New World. Rendition of a mulatta, daughter of a black and a Spaniard in Mexico City, capital of America, on the 22nd of August of 1711. And I'm just showing you here another painting from this set, which we have a black and white photograph because the painting is actually lost. We don't know where it is at the present time. Two sets dating from around 1715, attributed to Juan Rodriguez Juarez, one of the most acclaimed painters of the 18th century in Mexico, are the earliest extant examples to represent the colony's mixed races as part of a family group. From the first set, only 7 paintings are known. They all bear meticulously rendered inscriptions that define the racial combinations. In these 2 examples, the family groups are richly attired. The Spanish male is depicted wearing the characteristic Spanish long cape and broad hat that signified hidalguía, or purity of blood and honorable status. The mulatto woman and the Morisca child in the painting on the right are dressed in an attire worn exclusively by members of these racial groups, which we saw in Arellano's earliest depiction of the mulatto. Sumptuary laws prohibited black women and their descendants from wearing the same clothes of European and mestiza women. The waistcoat or bodice, which was usually made of silk, was called a manga. It resembled an inverted skirt fitted from the head, with its snap fasteners made of silver or a very bright color, and was reputedly very ostentatious. The same kind of richness of detail is present in these 2 paintings from the same set. On the work on the right, the Indian woman wears an intricately patterned huipil or native cloak, while the child proudly holds a hat full of pears, a typical European fruit, and perhaps a tacit allusion to the fact that New Spain's fecundity was such that it could, in addition to its local products, grow those of European origin. And here it is just too important to stress that at this time, many Europeans writers and intellectuals were describing the Americas as this land where everything degenerated: people, fruit, vegetables, animals. So in a way, by presenting this kind of typical European product, they're trying to make the point that everything grows there. This is, of course, just my interpretation, and I think Susan Dean Smith will talk a little bit more about this notion of degeneration. On the work on the left, the family group is placed outdoors in a vivid scene. The mulatto father plays a guitar while his son clasps his hands and sings along. The rendering of the mestiza's garb is extraordinarily rich. The collar and sleeves of her blouse, which are visible under her cloak, are lavishly ornamented with intricate lacework, and she also wears an abundance of pearls and corals as a necklace and bracelet. The second set, attributed to Juan Rodriguez Juarez, is formally and stylistically very similar to the one just discussed. The figures are prominently depicted in the foreground, and most of the castas are portrayed in equally lavish regalia. In addition, the paintings are not numbered, as are most sets from after 1760, which supports the hypothesis that they were intended to portray the different castas despite their racial makeup on equal footing. Closely related to Juan Rodriguez Juarez series is an incomplete set attributed to José de Ibarra. The extant canvases depict the different castas in full length, and the scenes are also not numbered. There is still much to learn about the creative process of colonial artists in terms of how they arrived at a certain idea and reworked the visual sources at hand. For now, it is assumed that the inventors of the casta pictorial genre are Manuel Arellano and Rodriguez Juarez, and that sets created after them, such as Ibarra's, continued their tradition. While the idea of exhibiting the racial combinations of the colony as part of a nuclear family group was probably the idea of Rodriguez Juarez, the widespread interest in Europe in foreign peoples and customs was also a potent catalyst in the creation of the genre. It is not coincidental that one of the sets attributed to Juan Rodriguez Juarez appears to end with two scenes describing an Indian wedding and burial. Two customs that several European authors considered fundamental when studying a foreign culture. Like the rest of the set, the scenes are presented in positive light. If the different castas are portrayed in luxurious garb as a way of showing the wealth and abundance of the colony, these images prove that its native population fully partook in two of the most important Christian sacraments. In fact, the idea of marriage is inherent in the casta genre. Some paintings even depict the mixed-race couple holding a wedding band, as in this work by José de Bustos, datable to around 1725, to symbolize the holy nature of their nuptial contract and to show the adherence of colonial society to Christian mores. In other words, New Spain was not only wealthy, but thoroughly civilized. It is an illustrated travelogue that seems to have provided the visual cue for the creation of the casta genre. The book China Monumentis of 1667 by the famous German Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher includes engravings of the costumes of the inhabitants of China, not unlike those in casta painting. Kircher's work were widely esteemed by the Creole intellectual elite of Mexico. We know, for example, that a complete set of Kircher's works were donated by Sigüenza y Góngora to the Jesuit College of San Pedro y San Pablo in Mexico City. Given the popularity of his books in New Spain, I argue that either Arellano or Rodriguez Juarez saw his China Monumentis, from whence they derived the idea to create the casta genre. Only this time, instead of simply depicting the different attire of the inhabitants of the viceroyalty, these artists gave visual shape to the concern with racial genealogy that had long obsessed Spaniards and Creoles. They constructed an image of a unified colony that reinforced the interrelated levels of subordination that helped guarantee the homeostasis of the social body for Spaniards. In other words, they created works that showed all the castas together but that featured the Spaniards at the top. The rationale of the Sistema de Castas or case system is explicitly articulated through the inscriptions on casta paintings. Because native Indians were considered new Christians, and thus legally Spaniards equals, the system contended that if they kept mixing with Spaniards, their offspring could become entirely Spanish on the third generation. The combination of either Spaniards or Indians with Africans, however, could never become white because Africans were associated with slavery and viewed as inferior. Each series is divided into three main units. The first group of paintings typically focus on the Spanish-Indian units, which beget more Spaniards on the third generation. The second group focuses on Spanish-Black unions, and the third on Black-Indian combinations, both of which do not result in more Spaniards. The importance of providing an image of a wealthy and restrained society was paramount to the preservation of the Spanish Empire. Both the Habsburgs and the Bourbons placed great emphasis on promoting the idea of a unified yet stratified kingdom and encouraged citizens to accept their place in the racial and social hierarchy. Festivals were one way in which colonial authorities could impress this idea on the mind of colonial subjects. The entry ceremony of the viceroy, who was the representative of the king overseas, and the oath ceremony, whereby colonial subjects swore obedience to the Spanish monarch, were a perfect example of how concerted efforts were made to promote the notion of a unified yet divided kingdom. For example, the 1640 entry of the new viceroy, the Marqués de Villena, included a number of presentations where Indian and Africans participated in various performances. They acted as representatives of their ethnic identities, all the while demonstrating their loyalty to the viceroy and the king. Villena's entry was sponsored by the city's cabildo, or the city council. And as the historian Linda Cursionagi has noted, the councilmen were intent on promoting the idea of the perfect vassal. Indians dressed in pre-Columbian costume to reaffirm their cultural distinctness, impressed the crowd with their martial abilities in mock battles, and dazzled the crowd with their dances, songs, games, including the famous voladores, or flying poles. At the same time, they performed as the subjugated natives by expressing their loyalty to the King of Spain. During the same entry, a group of beautifully dressed women of African descent danced for the new governor, stopping at distinct points in their performance to present a male actor speaking as though he was one of the women, explained each painting as it was brought forward. The paintings lauded the viceroy and emphasized the women's submissiveness, loyalty, and devotion to the Spanish king. Through a highly emblematic visual vocabulary, the images underscored the fact that the women were tarnished Africans. In one image, for example, the women represented themselves as a cannon fuse from Guinea in the process of being ignited by the rays of the sun, the viceroy. The fuse produced a gentle hazel black smoke, representing the love that the women felt for the viceroy after he had touched them with his rays. In addition, the actor, speaking as though he was one of the women, claimed, quote, "Although the color white limits who I am, if my love is great, this lack is not a hindrance," end of quote. In other words, blacks could be partially redeemed by swearing obedience to the Spanish ruling system. Another image further impressed the message by showing two black men in chains pleading for their freedom. The viceroy, according to the women, was renowned for his love of liberty, and they begged him to free the men depicted. The actor claimed that by doing so, the viceroy would demonstrate his valor and gallantry and forever enslave the men spiritually. This type of public ceremony was a highly complex apparatus of alliance, where individuals were compelled to perform their racial difference and accept their place in the social scaffolding that kept Spaniards at the forefront. If they were united, it was in their love for the king. Public festivals, such as the entry of Villena, show how images were powerful political tools and conveyors of meaning. In addition, the images brought forward during the viceroy's entry demonstrate how race was a well-entrenched tradition, how there was a well-entrenched tradition of representing the different races of the colony to underscore the significance of submission and integration. Besides paintings of Africans, images of the Aztec king also circulated within the colony at the time. The work served a double purpose. They showcased the glorious Indian past of New Spain, an aspect that Creole purposefully extolled as a way of distinguishing New Spain from Europe and to prove the greatness of the land before the arrival of the Spaniards. But they also emphasized the idea of subjugation, as in this late 17th century portrait of the Aztec king Moctezuma, who languidly abdicates his crown, already placed on the floor, as he accepts his fate under Spanish rule. The same idea of an orderly and prosperous city under Spanish rule finds its maximum form of expression in several folding screens of the late 17th century. On one side, the screens depict the fury of the conquest of Mexico, and on the other, the resulting glory, a symmetrical city filled with everything believed to constitute a real city: churches, fountains, parks, aqueducts, and so forth. Casta paintings from the first half of the 18th century respond to the larger discourse of Creole pride in Mexico, circumscribed within a wider acceptance of imperial designs. The earliest sets were commissioned by viceroys and ecclesiastical functionaries as a way of presenting to the King of Spain the different racial mixtures of the colony, and were also popular among a Spanish clientele. Created soon after several revolts threatened to overthrow the Spaniards from power, most notably the 1692 riot in Mexico City, the paintings might have been intended as reminders to the Spanish crown and his court that Mexico was still a rigidly structured society, an assumption corroborated by the work's inscriptions explaining the ideological workings of the system. That is, that there were mixtures that brought people closer to the white racial pole and others that distanced them. The deployment of the family trope created a sense of unity within hierarchy and promoted an image of domesticity that masked racial tensions. At the same time, the image of the family served to naturalize the social hierarchy portrayed in casta painting. Since the subordinate considered natural facts, other forms of social hierarchy could be depicted in familial terms to guarantee social difference as a category of nature. Otherwise put, the family trope served to stress the hierarchy inherent in colonial society and the success of the colonial enterprise by showing a society glued by the bond of love. A sort of imperial postcard, the paintings present a highly mediated vision of reality. They spread the idea across the Atlantic of a unified yet stratified society, one endowed with its own civitas, that is, its own spirit and values, forming part of the circuit of knowledge production within the Spanish Empire as a whole. Thank you very much.